Now, you should see a share a YouTube video link.
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sridhar Apasani. I am chairman of NATS Board of Directors. NATS, North America Telugu Society, is a non-profit organization. It's primarily focused on helping Telugu people in North America. And we also do a lot of service activities to help local communities we live in. In the current situation, we felt it is our responsibility to provide a platform to the young adults that came forward to speak up on what's going.
My name is Sonika. I'm a rising freshman at UC Berkeley, and my declared major is cognitive science.
I'm Anvita. I'm also a rising freshman, but at NYU, and my declared major is neuroscience.
So we decided to have this town hall because racism is such an important issue, and especially now with all the protests happening, it is very important that we address South Asians' role in the fight for anti-racism.
All right, so I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the background of what's going on at this point in time, who George Floyd is, and why this issue is so pressing. So on May 25th, 2020, which at this point in time seems like so far ago because of all that has happened, but honestly, it was only just a couple of weeks ago. George Floyd, who was a 46-year-old man, died in Minneapolis, Minnesota, after Derek Chauvin, who was a white police officer, knelt on his neck for almost 9 minutes while George Floyd was handcuffed behind his back while lying face down. He had been arrested on suspicion of trying to use a counterfeit $20 bill at a nearby market. There were several witnesses to this incident. However, none of the actual police footage that was supposed to be taken by body cams was released to the public. So this sparked a lot of outrage, especially since there were 3 other police officers who stood as bystanders during this entire ordeal, who could hear the pleas of George Floyd, yet did nothing about it. So they have been named also. So the videos of this incident circulated widely on social media, on news services, and such not, and security camera footage from nearby businesses as well. So this incident sparked protests immediately in Minneapolis, in the metropolitan area, which had turned violent just as police officers started to provoke the crowd. Initially, these protests were started to be peaceful. That was the intent behind them, to fight for George Floyd's legacy and life, and to express distress over what had happened to him. But in many videos that have been circulating around social media, especially Instagram and Twitter, there are many, many counts of experiences where police officers actively provoke protesters by either hitting them, trying to incite a reaction out of them as a reason to arrest them or put them behind bars, and to call the protesters violent themselves. Basically, these police officers have been trying to blame the public for what has happened. They're not trying to take blame for themselves. And because, so there's a saying going around called ACAB, A-C-A-B, which stands for all cops are bad, or all cops are bastards. And a lot of people have been supporting this statement, putting it all over social media, and are hoping to defund police, police organizations all over the country. I'm going to play a little clip of a video. Just give me 1 second.
This photo has haunted America this past week. And as horrific as it is, imagine if you lived in a country where the color of your skin got you killed for driving, jogging, sleeping, yelling, parking, babysitting, sitting in a van, selling CDs, selling cigarettes, opening the door, walking at night, wearing a hoodie at night, holding a toy gun, lying on the ground, being homeless, being in a dark stairwell, holding a cell phone, having a broken taillight, exercising horses, having a bottle of pills, shopping at Walmart, holding a BB gun at Walmart, holding a phone in your own backyard, eating ice cream in your own house, and shopping. You would say that is a lawless country. Who the fuck is running the show?
I apologize for that. All right, so Instagram, especially among younger people, has been an extremely big platform that people have used to raise awareness. There are several funds that people have been donating to recently, some of which are the North Star Health Collective, the Minnesota Freedom Fund, Reclaim the Block, Black Visions Committee, and Committee to Protecting Journalists. And Instagram has been a big platform where people are trying to not only just voice their concern, but also voice their support. However, in doing so, people have been looking at this platform of Instagram and almost blaming those who aren't voicing their support on such platforms, as if social media is one of the only platforms you can use to support the Black Lives Movement. And just to connect this back to kind of what's going on in DC and told by Trump. So although she's a Democrat, she was forced to bring in the National Guard because that was what the president had ordered. And if you look through Trump's Twitter feed, there's a lot of statements that are attacking the mayor, saying that her allowing Black Lives Matter to be written across the street, renaming the street, and showing her support for Black Lives Matter is not what a good leader should be doing, or is not something that he would support. And so this brings a lot of question as to whether or not our president truly believes that Black Lives Matter is an important cause that a lot of young people should be working towards or supporting, or whether he's focused solely on bettering his own campaign, his own image. Along with the Black Lives Matter movement and these protests came a lot of encouragements for people to start voting. A lot of states' primaries were a couple days ago, and the lines outside for those primary voting stations were a lot longer than people had even expected, especially amidst the coronavirus. So at least that is a bit of an improvement for now.
Okay, so thank you, Anvita. Before we go on to hear about the history of African Americans in America and more from the panelists, we wanted to give an opportunity to Delegate Suha Subramaniam to share his opinion on the Black Lives Matter movement, everything that's going on, and what policy changes we can hope to see to reach justice for everyone who's been oppressed in the past and continue to be.
Thank you so much, and thank you to NATS and to all the panelists. My name is Delegate Suhas Subramaniam. I'm a freshman in the House of Delegates, and I'm really excited to be here to be talking about this subject. I think one thing I was concerned about over the past year is that we have kind of taken our eye off of the criminal justice lens. And it took a very, very difficult experience that we've gone through over the past week to really get us back focused on this issue, because I know that a lot of people of color really affects them. I live in Loudoun County, and even in Loudoun County, it's not just police, and it's not just in the context of criminal justice. It's really all across the board. What you're seeing is in our education system and our socioeconomic system. Really African Americans, but just people of color generally, do still face obstacles. And we, I didn't think, 20 years ago that in 2020 we would still be needing to have this conversation, but the fact is we absolutely do. And so, a couple examples in Loudoun County, for instance, an African American student was chosen as the slave in a slave game, and everyone else had to treat him as a slave as part of this demonstration. There was another incident that a friend of mine had where an African-American friend who was stopped by a Loudoun County police officer and had a very terrible experience because of the color of his skin, and was treated very differently than, say, someone who wasn't African-American. So you might think that perhaps this doesn't affect you or it doesn't affect your community, but I'm telling you that it absolutely does. And so the anger you see, I don't condone the looting, I don't condone rioting, but the peaceful demonstrations you are seeing are the result of not just one incident, but really hundreds of years of incidents. And the fact that there hasn't been substantial change despite the cries, despite the voices that have spoken up. And so I'm very heartened by the fact that this is back to the forefront of the conversation, because I pushed for a lot of criminal justice reforms in my first session in the House of Delegates, and frankly, I thought we didn't do a good job. I was very disappointed. I had a bill on community policing and making sure people who are suffering from drug addiction would be able to work with the police. Police could take them to the hospital rather than jail. I supported several other bills on making sure people of color were not unjustly treated. There are a lot of people who are arrested for crimes that they don't even commit in Virginia, who they cannot post bail because they can't afford it, so they can't get out of prison. So they're in prison for 30 days because of a crime they didn't commit because they haven't been committed yet. The point is that there's so much we can do from a policy lens and from a socioeconomic lens, but we haven't done it yet. And that's why you're seeing what you're seeing. I think it's not a Democrat issue or Republican issue. I know Republicans I work with who want to do something, but they ask me how, and my answer is just listen to what people are saying, whether it's our bail system in Virginia or our prison system or our the way police are being trained. One of the good things, I think that there's some optimism to be had here, because I did a police ride-along the other day with a Loudoun County police officer who had just been trained and just started his job in the previous few years. And he said that now they have training for younger officers on police brutality, on dealing with people of color and different ethnicities and backgrounds. We actually, when I was on in the cruiser with him, he actually took me to a call where he was dealing with a Pakistani American family, and he was able to be very sensitive about some of the experiences they were having. They said that someone had vandalized their house because they were Pakistani, and rather than dismissing that as, oh, it was probably just some kids, he really took that to heart and reported that and did his diligence on that. And so I think that there is change, but change is not happening fast enough. And I think we can do more. I look forward to doing more, and I look forward to pushing both my Democratic colleagues, Republican colleagues, and both in the state of Virginia and federally. I'm going to keep pushing to make sure that we address some of these issues. And there are a lot of concrete steps we can take. But if you do not feel like your voice doesn't matter or that your voice is only one, because every voice absolutely matters. I can't do my job in making change and making new policies if my fellow legislators aren't hearing it from their own constituents, if they aren't hearing it from the news, from the demonstrations. So this absolutely matters. Protesting matters. Marching matters. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. And so I look forward to working with you, making sure that we make these changes and answering any questions you guys have.
Thank you, Delegate Subramaniam. I am going to, or do we want to take any questions first, or should we just continue with the panel?
I think we can just continue for now, and if any viewers have questions, we'll bring them up.
All right. So I'm going to give some history of African Americans in the United States, because understanding the foundation of their race in this country is very important to understanding how they have been targeted since before America was even its own nation. So Africans were brought by the Europeans to work as slaves because they were cheaper than the indentured servants that had been working before. So there have been generations of African Americans who have been born into slavery and died as slaves without ever experiencing freedom. They fought for their freedom and even fought in the American Revolution, contributing to the formation of the United States as its own country, only to be included in the Constitution as 3/5 of a person. Eventually, the 13th Amendment was passed to free slaves, but there was an exception to this. Slavery could be used as a punishment to a crime. So a lot of police officers targeted African American people and arrested them for small infringements or even doing nothing at all, just so they could go back to the plantations and work as slaves again. But a lot of our history classes don't teach us this. And even once slavery was officially abolished, they were far from freedom. They were far from free. They were forced into poor neighborhoods with weaker education systems and less resources, because many people refused to let Black people buy homes in their neighborhoods. And this is called redlining, and it's still prevalent today. And as we see, a lot of poor neighborhoods are occupied by the Black community. So segregation is the separation of Black people from white people, and this was prevalent until 1964 during the Civil Rights Movement. Think about that. The United States claims to be the land of opportunity and acceptance, but African Americans have been in this country since 1619, which was even before the United States was even its own nation. But up until 56 years ago, Black children were not allowed to go to the same school as white children, and discrimination was still legal. History classes paint Americans as heroes and talk about racism as if it was solved with the Civil Rights Movement, but it is so prevalent today, and it was not solved with the Civil Rights Movement. So this is why during protests, people are fighting against all the police and the system in general. No, not all individuals that work as police officers are necessarily bad people, but the institution the institution of police was founded on racism, and these individuals are contributing to a racist system, because police were formed to be slave patrols, and then they heavily targeted African Americans to send them back as slaves. And then even now, they patrol African American communities disproportionately over other communities, which leads to so many more African American people being arrested, and they are more likely to serve longer sentences than a white person that commits the same crime. It is not the individual people that they are fighting, but the entire system. So why should South Asians care? Is this not just an African Americans fight to fight? And like, why should we have to fight this? They have been fighting this since the foundation of their race in this country. They have been fighting for equality, but they will never truly achieve equality unless every single community in this country, including the South Asian community, is involved in this fight. And why specifically should we care? So a main subject in the discussion of racism is white privilege, which means that white people do not face hardships due to the color of their skin. That does not mean that they do not face hardships. It just means that they do not face hardships solely due to the color of their skin. So all people of color are subject to white privilege, including South Asians, but not in the same way as Black people are. And for the most part, Indians have a lot of privilege as well, even in terms of how we came to this country. So the United States purposely brought over the top 10% from Asian countries and gave us the best jobs. This contributes to the model minority myth, which shows certain minority groups as successful to diminish the idea that racism could still exist in this country. So they use the successful Asian Americans and say, look, these minorities are succeeding in this country. Racism doesn't exist. And this creates a racial wedge between Asian Americans and African Americans. This is all part of a racist system, and we cannot let it separate minorities. And the reason so many of us are here is because of the fight of Black people. The Immigration Act of 1965, the reason that a lot of us were able to immigrate here was due to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, when African Americans fought discrimination due to the color of their skin. And I'm going to play a brief video of Hassan Minhaj, who talks about this. And this is actually the same video that was played earlier. I highly recommend all of you watch this on your own time because he's a really powerful speaker. Okay.
This photo has haunted America this past week. And as horrific as it is, we're in this country because of protest, because of the civil rights movement. The only reason so many of us are here is because of the Immigration Act of 65. That law rode the wave of the Civil Rights Act of 64. Think of the chess moves. Martin gets Lyndon B. Johnson to sign that sheet of paper, and little do we know, MLK CC'd us on that email of progress. Because of that one signature, me and Abu were able to move to Edison, Fremont, Plano, Naperville, Irvine, Marietta, Dearborn, Twin Cities, Schaumburg, Sugarland, Long Beach, Dallas, Sunnyvale, Cupertino. You know, the factories that make us. In Karachi. But hey, it's not our fight, right? This is a black-white issue. America's story didn't start when we got here. When you became an American citizen, you don't just get to own the country's excellence. You have to own its failures. That is the deal.
Okay. So, as Hassan Minhaj said, we have to own the failures of this country. We have to fight for our Black brothers and sisters. Generally, Indians are known to stay neutral in terms of politics because, like, in Indian politics, they're very involved, very opinionated, but in America, they tend to not get super involved because they don't want to cause conflict or appear to be too political. But this is not an issue of politics, and it is an issue of humanity. As a human, that video of George Floyd being murdered should disgust you, and let that disgust and that image drive you to take action to prevent another person being killed because of the color of their skin. To speak more about the South Asian privilege, I will pass it on to Mahita.
Hi. So I'm going to be talking about the privilege that we as South Asians have. I just want to start by saying that this is a generalization. Of course, not all South Asians are privileged in this way, but just based on statistics and the people that I've known in my life, I know that the majority of South Asians are privileged in the law. So I want to talk about the American dream. The American dream is this idea that the US is a place where people can start at the bottom and grow to the top. And this is what a lot of immigrants hope to achieve when moving here. But the reality is that this really only applies to the people who already have some level of privilege. And even looking at myself and my friends that I grew up with, our parents all have really good jobs. And because of that, we lived in the richest county in Pennsylvania and went to one of the best school districts. So naturally, we had access to really good education. Our parents could put us in SAT prep courses. Our school offered a lot of AP classes, lots of extracurriculars. And so naturally, we got into the best colleges. And we're able to afford them because our parents are willing to pay for them. And because we're in the best colleges and get good college education, we get access to good internships. And because we're in good internships, it will lead to us getting good jobs. And even for Asians who aren't maybe as interested in school or don't go to top tier schools, almost everyone still goes to college and almost everyone is still pretty much guaranteed a comfortable life. So now think about a Black person living in a low income area where surviving is the priority, not education. They work part-time jobs because their family needs the money. And if they want to go to college, they either have to save up with money or they have to work really hard and get scholarships. A lot of South Asians that I've known either didn't do part-time jobs, or if they did, it was for fun or because it would look good on college applications. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I just want to highlight that difference. So we look at people like Oprah Winfrey or Obama who grow and get to the top and think that this is improving, but this is really only a small minority of people who are coming out like this. And in order to go to college, they really have to work hard and get scholarships. And a lot of South Asians tend to think, why can't they just work hard and study hard and go to college? And if they study hard, then they should be able to get scholarships from colleges. But we really take for granted the fact that education is a priority in our community. And it's really hard to get into that mindset and focus on college when it isn't ingrained in us, like how it's been for us. And that's not the case for the Black community, especially when they really need to focus on making money to survive. So after high school graduation, making money becomes a priority over going to college. So this whole thing is called systemic racism, and I have a short video that kind of explains it more clearly. Just give me a second.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard.
So I hope that video made it a bit clearer what systemic racism is. And I just want to share this statistic from a study I saw from 2016. It was for median incomes for different ethnic groups. So for Asians generally, the median income was 87,000. And Indian Americans are the richest ethnic group in the United States with a median income of 132,000, while the African American median income was 41,000. That means our median income is more than 3 times as much as that of African Americans. So we're really stuck in this system where just the rich keep getting richer and the poor stay exactly where they are. And this is kind of why the American dream is a myth. So next, I want to talk about COVID-19 specifically. A lot of you may or may not know this, but African Americans were disproportionately affected by COVID-19. In more than half the states, the cases and deaths of African Americans were proportionally 100 to 300% higher than for that of white people. Why is this? Because African Americans have higher rates of underlying health conditions because they haven't really received educational living a healthy lifestyle. And also generally in America, the cost of a healthy lifestyle is a lot more expensive than the cost of unhealthy food. And they also have less access to healthcare. And they live in cities with densely packed living areas. And finally, they work the essential jobs in factories, meatpacking plants, grocery stores. So because of this, they're exposed more and they take it back to these densely packed living areas, which spreads the virus more. And because of their underlying health conditions and lack of access to healthcare, they have higher death rates. And if you look at this, the same thing for South Asians, a lot of us were able to work from home in quarantine and really only go out for the minimum essentials while still being paid significantly more money than them. So next I want to talk about privileged racism, which is kind of the idea that as South Asians, we experience racism in a privileged way. So I want to say that I'm not trying to undermine the South Asian experience. Of course, our community has definitely experienced racism from like in school being made fun of for the way our food smells, or for our parents like making fun of their accents. Or when I was in high school, one of my friends, she was Muslim, we were walking in a mall and this white man came up to her and whispered terrorist in her ear. And of course, there's bigger hate crimes that happen all the time. But at the same time, most of us have never had to live in constant fear when we step outside because of the color of our skin. So I was watching this video by a Black man, and he was sharing some of the things that his parents had to teach him about going outside. Things like don't put your hands in your pockets, or don't put your hood on. Don't touch anything you're not buying. Never leave a store without a receipt. Never leave your house without your ID. If a cop pulls you over, make sure your hands are visible and ask for permission before getting your license or registration. They have to live in constant fear that the police might stop them and that they'll get arrested or even killed simply because of the color of their skin. So I grew up thinking that racism barely existed anymore. And this was because of the way history is taught in the US school system is it makes white people look like heroes, and that racism was pretty much abolished with first the Civil War and then the Civil Rights movement. And also the environment that I grew up in, I barely ever saw it. So I just thought that it barely existed. And the people who talked about it a lot were being political or overreacting. And that was my privilege. But going to college really opened my eyes. I've met all kinds of people that made me recognize my privilege. And of course, all of this and any racism is heartbreaking. And hopefully one day we can get to a place in the world where it doesn't exist anymore, but that's not the case in this current world or anytime soon. So hopefully we as South Asians can use the forms of racism that we've experienced to make us that much more sympathetic to the experience of the Black community. And we should be supporting them, not putting them down. And I have one final story. So I met someone in my internship. He's Black. He's from the local Boston area. He's from a low-income family. So once we were talking about quarantine, and he was saying that he is sick of being stuck at home. And I said, why don't you go on a walk? And he said, I can't go on a walk. It's dangerous. I might get killed. And I was just so shocked hearing that. Like, I think that especially really opened my eyes to how privileged I am. And I hope that it makes some of you appreciate your privilege too. And next, Raksha will be talking about the anti-Blackness in the South Asian community.
So this sentiment of anti-Blackness exists within our community, our culture, and in India itself. It primarily presents as something called colorism, which means that there's a discrimination against individuals with a darker skin tone. And if you even look at our film industries like Bollywood, Tollywood, Collywood, you really only see fair-skinned actors and actresses representing us, and they tend to set the beauty standard. So there tends to be this prejudice against people who don't have fair skin, and it's almost as if they're unattractive or not as worthy. And you also see it in things like fairness creams, like Fair and Lovely is always advertised if you watch any of the like Indian networks like CCTV or anything. And a lot of this comes from the British occupation of India. In British colonialism, even in that time, there was a lot of prejudice against African Americans and darker skin tones. And research has shown that that has kind of passed on down to us in our culture. And you see a lot of people making comments about people who have darker skin, both as immigrants in this country, but also back home. I personally have been told by people to not go out in the sun during the summer, or put on creams before I go out in the sun, or wear a hat or take an umbrella to make sure that I don't get dark, because that, and for me that almost reads as if I lose my worth when I get dark. And I think that's like almost a part of how we have evolved since British colonialism in India. And I think it's important that we, when we hear family members or friends or family friends make these comments about darker skinned Indians or darker skinned African Americans, to kind of catch that and correct them, or even correct ourselves when we have those kinds of thoughts, because it's kind of like we're acting for our community as well as for the Black Lives Matter movement. And in our younger generation, my generation in particular, there also tends to be this appropriation of Black culture. And by that, I mean that we take parts of Black culture as if it's our own. So this is like, you know, saying things like the N-word or getting cornrows. And that also kind of feeds into the prejudice against Black people, because we are taking in those things as if it's our own, but we're not understanding the history behind them, or you know, those kinds of things. And it's important to call that out when we see it too. And recently, especially on social media, I've been seeing a lot of questions about why specifically the N-word is used in songs, or people have been getting a lot of, you know, pushback from singing the N-word that's in songs. And there's all these questions about why that even exists in our vocabulary. And I just want to bring to light the history of the N-word. It was a very derogatory name given to the slaves that were brought to this country. And the reason that African-American musicians include it in their songs, and why the African-American community are the ones who are able to use this word, is because they're reclaiming the power in that word. So they're taking back the history and kind of moving forward and changing the meaning of what that word means to them. And so I encourage any of you, if you hear anybody use that word or hear anybody say that or get cornrows or do anything that's appropriating Black culture, to call it out and help them understand why that's not a good thing and why that kind of feeds into the racism. And when I was thinking about examples on how to better explain this, I was thinking about things in our own culture that are appropriated by even like in America. So for example, I was thinking about bindis and botus, and it's a big part of our culture and we understand the history behind it and the cultural significance of it. But in recent years, these kinds of botus and bindis have been become a part of music festivals, so things like Coachella, and that is them appropriating our culture because they're using it for their aesthetics and not understanding the history behind it or the significance behind it and why it's not okay to just use it as an aesthetic symbol. So I hope that helps in understanding why this is a problem. And then next, I want to touch on the stereotype that Black people tend to commit more crimes. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier with systemic racism and the way that the neighborhoods are almost built with low socioeconomic, where like the schools don't get as much money and there's not as many resources within the community itself. And that kind of explains the stereotype as well, because not only is there not good resources for these people who need the help to, move up the socioeconomic ladder, but there's also this high percentage of them that are incarcerated due to over-policing and discriminatory, like Black people, for example, are more likely to get charged for a crime than a white person is. And they're more likely to be convicted, and this skews the data. In addition, if you look at census data, the percentage that Black people make up in this country, I think, is about somewhere around 13 to 15%, but their rates of incarceration are almost twice that, which means that they're just more likely to be arrested and convicted even if they didn't do a crime. And we're seeing that a lot, especially in the videos and the stories that are coming out recently about people getting pulled over for just driving in their car or for walking on their street. So it's something to be aware of with this stereotype, is that it's not true and a lot of things feed into it. And I think Hassan Minhaj put it very well when he said in his video that we love seeing how high a Black person can ascend in America, but we have done nothing to raise the floor. So this basically relates to, Michelle and Barack Obama or Oprah and these people who are kind of tokens of the Black community who have been able to rise into these positions of power and influence. And we like seeing that, but we're not, as a community and as people who live in America and are part of America, we're not doing anything to help the community as a whole get to those places and work against systemic racism. So I'm going to pass it over to Sonika, who's going to talk about what we can be doing to combat this.
Okay, so now that hopefully everyone has a better understanding of not only the history of oppression in America that Black people have faced, but also how that has been continued for centuries and how American education has kind of clouded that in trying to present the idea that racism ended with slavery, even though we clearly see that's not the case with all the deaths that are happening and all the unfair treatment that our Black community members face. Hopefully a lot of you viewers are wondering, what can you actually do? Like, what actions can you take, not only in your community, but also within your own families, to educate people and help others understand, to empathize with the members of our Black community. And so the very first thing, which might seem like the most obvious answer, is to donate. Donate to organizations, to victims, to protesters, to Black-owned businesses, because we all know now that money has a lot of power in America. So putting money where your mouth is and actually donating to all of these organizations can help fund memorials for the victims of these crimes, help provide supplies, and help provide insurance to all of the protesters, bail funds for people who are out there protesting and face the harsh treatment from the police. By providing this money to all these different outlets like the ACLU, the Black Visions Collective, and Reclaim the Block. These are all movements that have come together to pool money and support all of the advocates for the Black Lives Matter movement. Beyond donating, what you can also continue to do is there's a lot of petitions going around, and these are all individual petitions trying to achieve justice for the individual victims of police brutality. So as we've seen for the George Floyd murder case, the 4 officers who were involved in the incident have been charged, and this is because of all of the petitions and protests that have been going on for the past week. But unfortunately, there are still countless victims of police brutality whose families have not gotten the justice they deserve. The police officers involved in those incidents are still out free and in the police system and are still engaging in corrupt behavior. So signing these petitions and creating the change that we have gotten for George Floyd is very important for continuing the progress of the Black Lives Matter movement. So by signing these petitions, you're not only demanding that the officers are charged for their crimes, but you're also raising your voice and building more fuel for the general Black Lives Matter movement and the justice that the Black community deserves in America. Another thing that needs to be changed in terms of action in America is the rate at which people, and specifically the South Asian community, goes out to vote. And we all know that the presidential election is very important, especially with the polarized political system we see in America right now. But I want to highlight how important it is to vote locally, not only for the president, because we see all these protests and riots and people have different opinions about these things, but we are seeing some slow change happening. But along with the protests, we need systemic and institutional policy and changes being made because of all of the systemic racism that exists that we talked about that have been built into the DNA of America since its birth. So to see this institutional change, policy and voting is the only way that we can actually create lasting change and sustainable change for the Black community. So even President Obama has spoken about this issue and says that it's important to protest and bring about public awareness to the issue and put a spotlight on the injustice. But even beyond that, in order for new laws to be made and institutional practices to be changed, we live in a democracy, so we need to vote for government officials who truly see the Black Lives Matter movement as an important issue and actually see the systemic racism that exists within our police system right now, and who will actually create change. So this is important not only on a presidential level, but also at your local level. So at local elections for your local legislative bodies, you also want to make sure you go out there and vote. Another way is to become educated on the issue. And so this panel hopefully has helped you today gain a more holistic understanding of everything that's going on beyond just what the news presents with the protests. But by engaging in conversations with Black members of your community, you can help understand their perspective. And especially during this time, their voice is incredibly important. And it is our role as minorities and also just humans who see the injustice that is happening to hear their voices and to listen and see how you can help the individual members of your community, because those people are just as important as the victims we see on the big TV screens. And one way you can start by doing that is supporting local Black-owned businesses, so restaurants, hotels, shops, boutiques, and local Black-owned businesses are especially struggling during this time. So coming together as a community to support these businesses is a great way to show that we care about the Black community and also care about the oppression that they've been facing for the past centuries. And what comes with educating yourself is also educating your family members and other members of the South Asian community, whether that be younger kids, maybe your younger siblings, or even older people like your parents and your grandparents, because racism is not an age-sensitive topic. This is something that's important for the entire community to come together, not just the young activists. And so when you're explaining these to perhaps your parents or older members of the community, you have to make sure to explain that the struggles of the Black community and their fight for equality and justice does not undermine the struggles or experiences of other immigrants or immigrants of the South Asian community, but rather how the injustice that they're facing right now is inhumane, and how the only way we can solve that is if all minorities come together to support the Black community and make life in America better for all minorities. So as you're educating yourself, make sure that you're not only watching the news, because sometimes the news can present skewed perspectives of the protests or the riots that we're seeing or what the police are doing, because oftentimes we see cases where police are perhaps kneeling at a protest to show their solidarity, but as soon as the cameras turn off, they're going back to throwing tear gas and rubber bullets at these protesters. So try to find firsthand accounts of what is actually happening at these protests, whether that be through social media or news outlets that are actually presenting the whole story. So it's important to stay informed and not be skewed by what you see on TV. And also during this time, it's amazing to see that a lot of well-known public figures in the Black community are coming out and sharing their voices and perspectives with facing oppression in America. So seeking the perspectives of these big public figures can help you understand how oppression finds itself even in these very successful people. So for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson recently put out a piece where he wrote about a reflection of the color of his skin. So he has a PhD, one of the highest levels of education, incredibly intelligent man, professor at Princeton, very, very highly educated and high remarks. And so he, like, the color of his skin didn't matter to him when he was conducting science or finding new discoveries, but as soon as he stepped out of the door, he was a suspect in crime in any situation. And so he would share about how since his childhood, his parents would have weekly meetings telling him what to do in the case of a police stopping you, because to the members of the Black community, every single time they encounter a police officer, it is a matter of life and death. So they have many precautions that they have to take, which is unfair when in fact the police should be the ones who know how to deal with the situation without putting civilians at harm. So as members of the South Asian community, it's our job to educate ourselves and empathize with other members of the Black community, and also understand that what is happening right now is inhumane, and how the years and the centuries of systemic racism in America are the reason that this still continues today, even though it seems like something that should have been solved ages ago. So there are some proposed action items and solutions that have come about because of all of the protests that are happening right now. And the first one of those is the idea of ending qualified immunity. So qualified immunity is a legislative law that exists in America today that allows police to get away with abuse and police brutality cases. So it's a legal loophole that shields government officials, and in this case specifically police officers, from being sued for actions that are outside their capacity. So any brutality or any harm caused to civilians, they are shielded from being sued from this if the exact phrasing of what happened doesn't appear within the Constitution. So, and that standard is nearly impossible to meet. So in all these cases where police officers ought to be charged for their crimes, they are able to pass away without any criminal justice being served to them because of qualified immunity. So the idea of ending qualified immunity reemerged recently, and the Supreme Court has many cases in front of them which have been dismissed on the basis of qualified immunity. So now we're slowly starting to see a change and an incentive to end the practice of qualified immunity so that police officers are actually charged for their wrongdoings. And another big topic of discussion that's happening right now is, in general, the idea of police reforming the police system. So there are some extremes to this, in that some people believe we should completely abolish the police system and instead put that funding into preventative measures in the community instead of reactionary measures. But there is a pretty big campaign going on right now called Campaign Zero, which outlines 10 different policies that can be added to, that can be reformed, that can be presented to the police system to reform the police system. And these include ending broken window policing, which means reducing the calls for police for small crimes, increasing community oversight, limiting the use of force, so limiting the use of force until it's absolutely necessary for a police officer, advocating for independently investigating and prosecuting the police officers. So in the case that there is a police brutality incident, seeking a third body or an independent body to investigate and prosecute the police officer rather than the criminal justice system, which currently unfairly favors the police officers. Increasing Black community representation, having body cams and filming the police, which has been attempted to be implemented in the past. Implicit bias training. So as we've talked about before, we all carry these implicit biases, but the thing is, the general public don't have the lives of other civilians in their hands at any given moment. So the police need this implicit bias training, not only to acknowledge their implicit biases, but understand how it affects their duty to protect civilians every day. And then also to end for-profit policing. So if money is involved in the police system, it only allows for more corruption. So ending for-profit policing is another way that we can limit the corruption in the police system. And that goes hand in hand with union contracts. And then finally, the demilitarization of police. So that means limiting the types of guns that police have access to and trying to reduce the violence in the general community. And so finally, everything in the end comes back to education and the community understanding of the issue that's happening. So we should continue to take broader commitments to anti-racist education in classrooms. So that means reaching out to your local government and advocating for the importance of teaching anti-racism education in classrooms. So like Mahita was talking about earlier, the American education system teaches that slavery was so long ago and that the civil rights movement ended slavery and that ended racism, and we have no more racism in America, but we clearly see that is not the case. And the civil rights movement was actually much more recent than it may seem. So the effects of the civil rights movement are still being seen today and are still being fought for by the Black community. So by modifying the way that slavery and racism is taught in the classrooms, we can build a better foundation from a younger age for a new generation who understands and empathizes with the struggles of the Black community. So on a final note, we just call to the South Asian community to see their role and break the silence that the South Asian community might usually have, and understand that it is our job as minorities to stand with the Black community and fight for justice for all. So I think that is all that the panelists had for today. So I think we're going to try to take some viewer questions and answer them for a few minutes. So our first question is, what do you think are the first steps we need to take in terms of policy to decrease the police brutality rates and racial profiling? So any of the panelists can come up and speak to this question.
I think that one of the things is definitely changing, like the thing that you mentioned with the qualified immunity, and changing that policy where the cops have that protection. And also, one thing that I think could be useful is offering cheaper lawyers for African Americans, because a lot of them can't afford the lawyers, and then they're convicted because they, don't have good lawyers. So I think, and that also kind of goes to like where you can donate. So I think that's also policies that could change.
Also, like within the system, I think that police officers need to be trained in terms of racism, because like they need to be trained and to make sure that like any police officers that show signs of racism, like they shouldn't be allowed to be police officers. And like I think racial bias training is extremely important because it can kind of weed out some of the racist people. And I think this is like something that can be ingrained in the system, and it should just be part of their training. And like I don't really know why that hasn't been, like I feel like it should have been a part of their training already, but obviously it hasn't been. So I think that is definitely something that could, if that's put in place, then we could potentially see less cases of police brutality.
I think also de-escalation training should be really important, especially because police deal with so many like pressing, difficult situations, and I think there needs to be more ingrained training on how to talk down someone who they think is going to be violent or actually is going to be violent before resorting to any sort of violence themselves.
Yeah. Anita, you're muted.
Okay. Are you muted? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I was just going to say also, we touched on over-policing a little bit, which is the idea that police are sent to these poor, supposedly higher crime neighborhoods, but this just creates a loop where because there are more police, these neighborhoods seem like they have more crime because there are just more police to catch even smaller incidents. So eliminating over-policing and eliminating the over-policing of poor neighborhoods can reduce racial profiling, and then also ending stop and frisking of people based on just a suspicion of race or gender or anything beyond what should be known suspicion.
I also just kind of want to speak how this go in here, because this has raised a lot of traction. I think most people are just really sick of seeing this happen. The thing in the U.S. Judicial system called precedents, that if one case, like say one case, they arrest the police and they get convicted for murder, then that will set the precedent for this to continue to happen in the future. So if we can just keep going with the traction on just this one case, that'll change a lot for future cases.
Okay. If no one has anything else to add, we can go on to our next question, which is we see that there are a lot of protests happening and even some more violent riots that are happening. So what is the purpose of these protests, and how do we differentiate them from the riots that are some people see as harming the community and the movement rather than helping?
I personally, sorry, go ahead.
Well, one thing that I do believe is, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a couple of friends who have actually gone to protests, and kind of the way that they end up going is they start out pretty peaceful, but the people who are protesting are often provoked by police themselves. And a lot of people talk about how they see riots as dangerous, how it's almost reinforcing the stereotypes surrounding the Black community that people tend to get violent in certain situations. But I think it's also extremely important to recognize that riots are not the problem. They're the symptom of a much larger problem of mistreatment over years and decades and centuries of being told that these stereotypes are what define them for the rest of their lives. I do believe that, a lot of these businesses, people who own businesses who have been, whose businesses have been destroyed, if their glass has been broken, have spoken out, saying that recognize that their collateral damage that will lead towards some sort of betterment in society. As we've seen, because of these protests, the 3 other officers in George Floyd's case have been charged, and the main officer who murdered him had his charge moved from 3rd degree to 2nd degree murder. So clearly something is working here.
Also, with protests, it's really important to, there are a lot of videos and stories out there from people who went to the protests and like their own personal experience. And a lot of them are talking about how like they were peacefully protesting and the police like were laughing at them, or like I saw one video from, it was specific to the Austin Police Department, and she was talking about how like she was peacefully protesting and they were like laughing at them, winking at them, kind of laughing, and when even like they were crying and these police officers were just like making fun of them. And that may not be the case for like throughout the country, but it's really important to listen to the experience, because the news doesn't show, they show the most extreme cases, but these personal experiences will show you every part of it. And like I read a story yesterday about how, I forget where it was, I think it was with the LAPD. They were like, all the protesters were like they put zip tied like handcuffs, and they were taken on a bus and like for hours, and they were like they started playing like extremely loud music, and people were having panic attacks and screaming and like peeing themselves because they didn't know where they were handcuffed, and they took them like an hour away from their homes and gave them no way to get home, and like they were zip tied handcuffs, and to get them out, I think one girl, they cut her hand, like she had her whole hand, both her hands were sliced open. So these experiences are really important to read, because the news doesn't reflect accurately about everything that's going on. So like find your own resources, find the personal experiences, and I think that's will get you the most accurate about what's happening with the protests.
I think kind of going off of that too, it's important to recognize where the source of the violence is coming from, in addition to the police, specifically with rioting and buildings being damaged and businesses, getting looted. A lot of that they've found specifically in Minneapolis. The mayor made a statement saying that they had arrested a lot of people that were connected to the looting, and they had been part of white supremacist groups from out of state. And a lot of people are using the protesting as an excuse, like we said before, to continue perpetuating a stereotype that Black people are dangerous or they commit more crimes, which really isn't true. Yesterday, I read an article about an alt-right white supremacist group called Boogaloo, who goes around and basically creates, I forget what they're called, but they're like a type of homemade bomb. And they kind of just like leave them around to blast things up or to light police cars on fire. And that's why it's, like we've been saying, it's important to recognize where you're getting your information from, because this isn't the kind of stuff that's shown on the news. And even with the people who are vandalizing and looting businesses, I've been seeing a lot of videos of the organizers of the peaceful protests or other people who are part of the protests that are nearby, kind of stopping it from happening, or taking away whatever they're using to break the window, or taking away the spray paint cans and taking videos of them. And a lot of the people who are doing that, the majority from what I have seen, are not people of color, not Black people. So it's really important to recognize that as well.
Okay, thank you, Raksha. If no one has anything to add for that question, our next question is, what do you feel is the role of the president to serve as a unifying force to the country during this time of uncertainty and protests? And then what do you think will happen in the future in terms of the potential deployment of the National Guard or using force within the individual states?
I think something that's actually kind of interesting at this point. Hear me? I'm sorry, I don't know if my connection is good. Can you guys hear me? I think something that's interesting to point out, I was reading on Twitter actually, how some people were talking about how it took months and months for them to set up centers for COVID patients, anyone who was affected by COVID-19, but it just took them days to mobilize forces, which I think goes to show just how much money is allocated towards police departments, towards the National Guard, and towards the military in this country. And Trump clearly supports in doing so. And I think at this point in time, it's difficult to gauge just how much power he has as a president, just how much executive force he could apply with dispelling the National Guard across the country. It's already happening in DC. Some of my friends who went to the protests in DC could speak for that themselves. And I think that Trump's stance at this point in time, he wants to mobilize the public. He wants positive opinion of him. And in order to do so, I think he'll do anything that his supporters would like him to do. I think a lot of what he's done over the past 4 years has been for political gain, less so worried about people's personal health or their well-being.
Also, I saw an image or I read something that talked about the budget. I forget if it was for a certain state or for the country, but they increased police funding and decreased public health funding, which is, I mean, that's kind of ridiculous considering that we're in a pandemic. And I think the role of the president should be to kind of give a promise to the Black community that there will be change, especially in a time like this. Like, they need to hear that from a leader, but there will be change, there will be policies. I don't think Donald Trump has any intention of doing that, and I don't think he really believes in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think anything he does is for, as Anvita said, for political gain. So I don't the Black people, and I don't think any person of color can really depend on him for any justice. So, but as we talked about earlier, there is change being made. Like, even if the president doesn't do anything, we can still the George Floyd, the police officers that killed him, or the police officer and the other police officers there were charged, but now a lot of the movement has changed to Breonna Taylor, who was killed, and the police officer that killed her are still free. So now we know that we can change, and we can get these police officers charged. So I think if you haven't, I signed the petition. I'm sure all of you have. So if you haven't signed that petition, sign it. It takes 2 seconds, and we really don't need the president to issue any. We can do it on our own, even if he doesn't care about the movement.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue is that Trump is just focused on the wrong things. He is so focused on the protests and the rioting and the looting, which to an extent is valid because, you don't want to see all these cities be destroyed. But he's putting aside the actual issue, and he has barely talked about George Floyd or the Black Lives or anything. He's just so focused on this because that's what's going to get his supporters' attention. And I think it goes back to what Sonika was talking about earlier, how important it is to vote and just educate yourself and just make sure you know the power that political leaders have.
Okay, thank you. We have another viewer question from Renu Tirumala, and he's asking the panelists, what are some concerns that aunties and uncles present when you discuss Black Lives Matter with them? So what are some concerns you've heard from older members of the South Asian community when you try to discuss this issue with them?
I think one of the issues we hear is like it's not really our place, or it's like a political issue. Like even like talking about it publicly could be like seen as political, and like if we don't want to associate with a certain political party, like we shouldn't really talk about it publicly. But as I said, like when I was talking earlier, it's not an issue of politics, it's like a humanity issue. So that's one thing. And also I think that a lot of people don't really know, like a lot of people in the Indian community don't really have Black friends, or like close Black friends that like they specifically can like take action to like if they, like I think if you have Black friends, you can kind of talk to them about their experience, and not all Indian people do, especially older members. So, but I don't think you necessarily need, I mean, I think younger people who are in school and in college should go out of their way to make Black friends, because it's always good to be have exposure to other cultures. But with older members, I don't think it's really necessary. Like you don't really have to know any Black people to take part in the movement. You can read stories online. There are so many stories of like poor people, homeless Black people who had like fought their way and went to college, or still face so much discrimination. So I think like reading those stories kind of helps you get some insight into what they face.
I also think understanding the difference between the experience as a minority, as a Black minority versus a South Asian minority in America, can help them understand why the oppression is such a big deal and the injustice is so unfair for the members of the Black community, because African Americans, when they came here because of slavery, it was not by choice, it was involuntary. And so for the past 200 years, this has been their only home, and they have no other home, they have no other country to call their home. So when they see injustice and when they're being treated unfairly, and they were brought to this nation unwillingly, it only further creates a sense of anger between the majority white population and all the minorities. So by banding with the other minorities like the Black community, we can make it better for all minorities in America.
Yeah, I think also a lot of South Asians just tend to think that racism is racism and don't really realize that there's different degrees of racism. So they'll be like, you know, we faced racism and dealt with it, so why can't they? But like, as I kind of talked about earlier, we deal with racism in a more privileged way, and it's just a completely different thing. So I think it's important to realize that there's a big difference, and that we should be supporting them, because we know what racism feels like, and if it's a lot worse for them, then we should be able to help
I think something that I want to bring up is it's not just within the South Asian community, but just in general. A lot of people have been feeling uncomfortable or acting uncomfortable by hearing this stuff. And I think it's important to have uncomfortable conversations, because if it's uncomfortable, it means it's important. And it's okay to change your mind, and that's something that I think is also should be brought up. When you get new information, it's completely okay and should be normal to change your mind. And I know that it can feel uncomfortable to kind of change your own thought processes and the way that in the culture that we've grown up in, but it's always a good thing to move forward rather than be stagnant or move backwards.
I have another question from a viewer who is asking that reform has been attempted in the police system in the past, when we have seen police brutality in past years with the addition of body cams and attempted implicit bias training in the past. So clearly the reform is not done what it's needed to do because we continue to see the cases of police brutality. So how will reform be different this time, or instead do we need to try to change the police system from its foundation since it is built on corruption and racism?
So I think that the attention that this case is getting is really important. And I think if this traction carries, they really won't have a choice but to make changes and convict them on murder, because I was talking to my friends about this. I can't even imagine what would happen if they were not charged guilty. Like if it's this, like, you know, there are this many riots and protests now, it would be crazy if they were charged not guilty. So I think there's hope that this case might actually change if people hold on to the traction and don't just kind of forget about it the way like that happens a lot with these cases.
I kind of agree with that, but I also kind of disagree with that in the sense that, yes, I'm pretty sure they will be charged and, go to jail and get a sentence and everything. But there's also, like, especially with protests, we're seeing that even with cameras on, police don't really care. They're still being brutal. And I don't know if everyone has seen this video, but there was a video from Atlanta the day that the curfew was first announced, and the information for the curfew had not gone out at that point. There were two cars of students. The front car had only white students in it, and the black car had only black students in it. Or the back car had only black students in it. And the two in the back car were the ones who got tased and pulled out of their car because the police thought that they had a gun, but the body cams show that there was no movement to indicate that there was a weapon in the car. And even with cameras on, and even with all this stuff happening right now, those kinds of actions are still being done. So I do think there needs to be a more complete change in the way that the police work. And I like the ideas that are coming out about enforcing more improvement things rather than punishment things, like helping people with drug issues get the help they need, or other initiatives like that, more so than actual policing. And I think decreasing the power of the police will go a long way into doing that if they're more seen as civil servants of the law rather than enforcers of the law. I think that idea is more the way that things should be going. But I'm not sure how long it will take to get there, because they still clearly are behaving the same way, if not worse, in front of the cameras. So.
Yeah, I think going off of that, it's also like kind of the second part of the question. Like that's why it's so important to be picky when you're actually choosing who's going to be police officers, and making sure that they're doing it for the right reasons, and like not just because they're power hungry. Like I know that the way the police academy and like the way it's chosen, like the way people are chosen, there's going to be a lot more focus on like physical, like how physically strong you are and like your knowledge of the system, but not really like your personality or like your racial opinion as much.
I think one of the biggest issues is the very clear hierarchy that the police system has among the public. Even when I think of the police, I think of them as some sort of almost untouchable body that kind of overlooks everything that happens within citizens or within our public life. And I think, as someone else mentioned, creating more civic engagement programs, having trusted adults help address smaller issues instead of calling the police for every little altercation someone may experience, would definitely decrease almost the pride, but in a negative way, that the police may hold, or almost a jurisdiction they may feel over every little thing within the lives of the people they're supposed to protect, but instead almost rule.
And I think we all, or at least speaking for myself, I sit in a privileged position to think of the police system as a source of security and and help. But that is not the case for many members of the Black community, which is exactly why there is such a big movement going on about it right now. So a lot of people have brought up the idea that even though there are some bad cops in our police system, people think that there are still good cops who are performing their duty as a police officer correctly. But the problem with that is the fact that the police system itself, as an entire organization, is built on racism and corruption. So even if there are individual good cops in our police system, if they try to bring to light any injustice that is being done by other cops, they're pushed to the side and silenced. Their voices are silenced. So any instances where these good cops or these individual cops who are good people are trying to do the right thing, the police system as a whole doesn't allow for any progress to be made. So that's a big issue that people see happening now that reform and policy is trying to address, but it might be a much more deeply rooted issue in America.
I've heard a really good analogy that kind of explains the whole, like, there are good cops out there and the bad cops are just a few bad apples. And they were kind of talking about the fact that the police system is there to do a job to protect people. And they had an analogy where they were talking about how doctors are there to save people, and the same can't be said about doctors. There's just a few bad doctors. No, if that was the case, then we would want those doctors to be fired and the system to be improved, because none of us would want to be operated by a surgeon who is not a good doctor and hasn't gone through all the requirements to be a good doctor. And I think the same thing should be applied to police as well.
Another question from a viewer who is wondering, they understand that Black people have been clearly oppressed for centuries because of the racist system in America, but how do we empower the Black community rather than simply painting them as victims in this situation?
I think the number one thing is giving them a voice, and a voice to be heard, and a voice to be amplified. A lot of that does get overlooked, even in these movements where Black people are not given the platform in order to talk about their issues and bring light to their issues. And I think it's important to also let them lead the discussions of how things should be improved, because they're the ones who are directly facing the discrimination and the racism.
Yeah, going off of what Raksha said, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that Black people need you to speak up for them. They have their own voice, and oftentimes people say patronizing things that almost demean the voices of Black people. Even if their intentions are positive, the nuances of their vernacular may not be. But recognizing your own stance, how lucky you are to be in the position that you're in, is the most important step. And to let Black people lead the discussion regarding themselves is the number one thing to do, because it truly does deal with them and not us.
Yeah. Go ahead. Okay. I was gonna say, I think also, like, recognizing that how important it is to just help them with their education, like, either donate or volunteer, and like help them realize the value of education, because I think that will make a big difference in their community if, like, education becomes more of a value like it is in the South Asian community.
The only other thing I was going to add was, like Anvita was saying, is to listen to the voices of the Black community, but also it's not the job of the Black community to try to educate others or educate other minorities to try to care about their issues, but instead we should learn to take it upon ourselves, as we've been doing, to educate yourself and then also advocate for the education of others who don't see the issue in the same eyes that you might see it in. And then we have one last question from our viewers who are asking for some kind of like final action line of what each of us individually think we'll be doing in the next few weeks or in the next few months or however long this movement might take to get real justice. What do we see ourselves doing as advocates for the movement?
So I watched this video that Obama tweeted. It was on some news channels. It was George Floyd's brother basically speaking out, and his message was educate yourselves and vote, not just for the president, but for local officials. And so I know that honestly, besides the president, I do not know a lot about any other member of politics. So I want to try to learn more about, like, you know, who local leaders are and what power they have, like, to know who I can vote for.
I think I'll be focusing on, there's been a list of like books and documentaries gone around that I think I'm going to take the time to read or watch, podcasts and things like that, not just in terms of police, but also racial disparities in like healthcare and all these different fields, and just try to get a better understanding of the whole issue, and keep listening to ways that I can help.
So I started listening to this podcast called 1619, which is actually the year that slaves were brought by Europeans. So I really recommend that. I haven't finished, but it's, I think, 6 episodes. I listened to the first and started the second one, but it gives you a lot of background on history that isn't taught in the classroom, and I'm sure a lot of you don't really know all that history. So I really recommend you listen to that. I also started watching the documentary 13 about the 13th Amendment. So I recommend you also watch that. And I think something that's really easy that we can do is supporting Black businesses. So I will be trying, like, if I go back to Pittsburgh for college, and if I'm like, I go out to eat sometimes, like seeing, there's so many lists out there about Black-owned businesses. So when I go out to eat, maybe going to those restaurants rather than like the chain Chipotle or Panera Bread, and supporting them. And obviously donating, like I've donated to a few organizations, but like even any amount is important. So I think like I'll continue to like see what organizations like need the most help and making donations. And I think the most important thing is listening to the Black community, seeing what they recommend that we do, because I think that's one of the most important things that you can do, like see what they want us to do.
I think something that I'm going to keep in mind continuing forward is the idea that Black Lives Matter and advocating for Black rights is not a trend. It's not something that can be dealt with just by posting a Black square on social media or putting a donation link in your bio, although those are important things. I think one of the most important things would be to continue advocating at the exact same fervor that I am right now, going on forwards, supporting Black businesses, as you guys are saying, continuing to educate myself, because there's actually a report published by our school about how many Black kids were admitted to the class of 2024 for high school, and that number was 0. And it was very eye-opening, not necessarily because our school was the issue, but that we've let society come this far to the point where this is something acceptable and something normal, and something that we may not have even noticed unless we had been talking about Black Lives Matter during this time period. So I think just being more vigilant about the media that I'm consuming, what I choose to understand, what I choose to advocate for in my future is what I'll be doing.
Okay, so thank you for everyone for sharing how you'll be continuing your advocacy in the future. That was the last question from our viewers. So I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to Nats and NRI Streams for providing a platform for us, a younger generation, to advocate for this movement that we believe in, and handing it off to Mr. Afsani for any final words that he has.
Okay, I would like to congratulate and thank you, all of you, You have done really, really great job. It's definitely an eye opener, at least for me, and I'm sure whoever watched in my generation. We have not known many of the things like you shared. We have no idea, and we are living in the perspective like black communities. They have crime, and we are all in safe zones. But it's definitely an eye opener. I'll try to do anything in my capacity, and with nats also, like to do some programs like which benefit awareness among our communities and to help black communities. And I also take a minute to thank NRI Streams for providing this platform, and also NATS President Srinivas Manchikalapudi and NATS Board and EC for encouraging us to conduct this program. And once again, thanks and congratulations to all of you for coming forward and speaking out your hearts. And at the end, I will also try to do whatever you all intend to do. I like the ideas, and I will try my best to follow that. Thank you. Have a good day.